Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Francina Dominguez from the UIUC Department of Atmospheric Science. She received her PhD from UIUC as well and is now the head of the hydrometeorology group there. And her research focuses on interactions between the land and atmosphere. So theories of how changes in the land surface affect climate, and then more applications focused work about how climate change will affect surface hydrology. And today she'll be talking to us about moisture in the Amazonian basin and possible impacts of future deforestation, which I'm really excited to hear about.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. So let me, okay. Okay. So just take this out. Okay. Whoa. One second. There. So again, thank you for the introduction. I tend to not be able to pay attention to the chat and speak. So if I don't answer chat questions, I'll do it at the end. It's been a pleasure to speak to the students and faculty, and I'll touch upon a lot of the topics that we've discussed throughout the day here today. So again, the title of my talk is Recycling of Moisture in the Amazonian Basin and Possible Impacts of Future Deforestation. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Jorge Rasbarza and Zhao Yang. So Jorge is in Spain and Zhao Yang is at PNNL. Also, this work is funded by NSF and the visualization and computation mostly in Excel. So first, I want to give you a geographical context of where we're at. So this is South America. The Amazonian basin is delineated in black. These are the Andes Mountains. I'm from Colombia, so I'm from this northern tip of South America, and part of the Amazonian basin is within Colombia. There's also the La Plata River Basin that I work a lot on, but today I'll be focusing only on the Amazonian Basin. So we talked with Christian about this kind of seminal work of Enea Salati regarding their analysis of O18 isotopes in precipitation. And based on that analysis, we've known for a long time, this is in the 1979, this was published. So we've known for a long time that a large percentage of the precipitation that falls within the Amazon forest comes from recycling of water, so evapotranspiration from the forest itself. And part of the reason is geographic, essentially. So if we look at moisture budgets within the region, you have a large amount of moisture coming in from the Atlantic. Then you also have evapotranspiration from the forest. And you have this natural barrier in the Andes Mountains here which blocks that moisture and promotes recycling within the basin. The tricky part is to figure out of the rain that falls in the basin, how much of that, what percentage of that is from evapotranspiration. And one of the ways to do this is with isotopes, as Enea Salati did. But an alternative way is using numerical models. So here I've basically made a laundry list of models that that allow us to estimate sources and sinks of precipitation. And they range, so anything blue are analytical models. These green ones are offline, either Eulerian or Lagrangian models. And these bottom ones are essentially water tracers embedded within either global or regional climate models. And they're all based on conservation of moisture. So the equation of conservation of moisture with all the different terms, conservation of moisture in the atmosphere with all the different terms that this entails. So a model such as Insoacosta Miguez Macho, which is the one that I'm going to be focusing on today. So that would include basically all of these terms in relatively high spatial resolution and spatial and temporal resolution. Whereas if you start moving kind of up this list, you start neglecting terms in this equation until you're left essentially with the first Boudico model, which is one-dimensional and essentially neglects all the terms except here the divergence term in one dimension. So this, and just as an aside, so this was, where am I here? This is my PhD work over here, working with kind of simple models. And this is part of this list is part of a paper that I recently wrote where I talk about this slightly more complex analytical model. But again, today I'm going to be focusing on this one, the last one, which is tracers embedded within WRF. Okay, so out of all these, as you can imagine, because this problem is so appealing, the one about the Amazon, a lot of these models have been used to estimate the recycling ratio, which is this idea of how much of the total precip in the Amazon comes from local evapotranspiration. And these are basically all of the models that have tried to quantify this. And they again range from simple analytical models to offline models. And this is tracers in a GCM, and this is tracers in a regional model, which is the data that I'm going to show today. So something, when I saw this graph, I was struck by how consistent they are. So even if you're talking about extremely simple models or where tracers embedded within WRF, we're talking about 25 to 35% of the rain that falls within the Amazon is of local origin. So these studies have largely focused on monthly or longer timescales. And what I'm going to ask today is, what happens at shorter temporal scales and what happens if the forest changes, if there's deforestation. So in the first part of the talk, I'll analyze precipitation recycling at intradaily to seasonal timescales. And in the second part of the talk, I'll evaluate how land use change can affect regional hydroclimate. So let's start. Okay, so as I said, we're using the WRF regional climate model to tag the moisture coming from the Amazonian basin. The tagging algorithm is described here in Insoacosta Miguez Macho 2018. This is the domain of analysis. These are 20-kilometer, 10-year simulations. 40 vertical levels. We are using the Miguez Macho fan groundwater scheme. So I've talked to several of you about groundwater today. So we are using that, varying vegetation with MODIS. And something important to realize is that the tracers are have only been applied to some of the physics schemes. So these are the physics schemes that have the tracer capability. And the way that you can think about this is as if you were putting dye on the water that evaporates from the Amazon and then following it in space and time, including change of phase. So this is my cartoon of the way I think of these tracers. And I think this also goes as to, I had some questions today about the differences with isotopes. This is a difference in the way that you kind of conceptually thinking about the tracking of moisture. So before I begin, I just want to give you kind of an overall view of the hydroclimate. So what I'm showing you here, the colors are tracer integrated water vapor. So the water vapor that originates as evapotranspiration from the Amazon. These arrows are total integrated water vapor. And what we see is that during the December, January, February, so the warm season, this moisture enters from the Atlantic, traverses the Amazon, and travels essentially towards the southwest until it encounters the Andes Mountains, the formidable wall that then makes that flow veer and go towards the east and southeast into the La Plata Basin, essentially here. So that's kind of the way that the moisture circulates. During the dry season, the Austral Winter, we have more zonal flow, and you have the moisture traverses the Amazon, but then veers north into Colombia and Venezuela. So that's slightly different circulation. And so you see the evidence of this in the tracers, right? So the tracers accumulate here in the northwest and here in the southwest. Okay, so if we think about the spatial pattern of precipitation recycling, so that means within each of these pixels, how much of the total rain that falls within that pixel, total precip in that pixel, comes from evapotranspiration. So that's the way I'm going to come from evapotranspiration within the entire Amazonian basin. So that's what this is depicting. And of course, this follows from these climatological circulation patterns, where in December, January, February, you have recycling ratios of about 40% here in the southwest of the basin. So the strong gradient going from northeast to southwest. During the dry season, JJA, the winter, you have more of a zonal gradient, higher recycling ratio. So more than 50% of the precip that falls in the eastern side of the Andes Mountains is of recycled origin. So it follows the climatological circulation patterns with higher recycling ratios in the JJA season. And this is just the annual average, including the entire year. So those are kind of when we talk about 30% of the moisture coming from the Amazon basin, it's important to keep in mind that there's a very strong spatial gradient that is included here. So now that I've kind of established that, I wanted to show you the visualization of this data. So this is perhaps the first time in my life that a visualization has spurred my research question. And this is the person who visualized this is David Bach from the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. And we presented this at a conference, and then we had interest from some musicians to put music to this. And so this is John Mantinga from the University of Vermont, Ki-Young Lee, and Ha-Young Park from South Korea. So I'm not a musician, but something cool that they did was that I gave them a time series at different altitudes of the moisture of local origin, and they put music to it. So that's what you're going to hear. I don't know if it'll be super clear via Zoom, but so this is data sonification of this. So let me try. So the colors are the tracers, and the white streamlines are total vapor flux. and the green ones are Amazonian vapor flux. So the first thing that you see, so this is 3 months of simulation. Okay, so that beating is at the intradaily time scale. And you see, so this is related to the South American low-level jet. Okay, sorry for the abrupt closing there. So what was striking to me when I saw that video was that beating pattern. So I had never seen that before. So I was wondering, you know, what that is. And of course, I thought that it had to do with the diurnal cycle, but I wanted to kind of dig into that. So what we did, so after David created this visualization, was to try to analyze this as a time series. So here, what I'm showing you in blue is the total integrated water vapor over the basin, averaged over the entire basin. And in green is everything related to the tracers, so of local origin. So blue is total, green is local. And we did time series analysis. So we analyzed the Fourier spectrum, and so all of these figures are going to look very similar. So here, anything that's blue is related to the total. Down here, I'm visualizing the annual cycle and comparing that to either reanalysis or trim data. And you'll see in a little bit that I do a similar thing with the tracer one. So anything on the left is going to be total. So the first thing that we saw was that for the total integrated water vapor, you had a very clear annual cycle and a 6-month cycle. So a secondary peak of 6 months. And so that secondary peak is linked to the migration of the ITCZ. So essentially you have the ITCZ that crosses twice over the northern Amazon, but only once over the southern Amazon. So that's why you see that 6-month characteristic frequency here. And this is related to Paulina's work on the Hadley cell, right? So we see that the key months here are, as I said before, the wet season is January, February, March, and December, and this is the dry season, the dry winter season. Now here on the right, I'm showing the same thing, but for the tracers. So unlike the total integrated water vapor, the tracer does not have such a strong annual signal. It has a strong 6-month signal. And we also have a very clear diurnal cycle. So this is what we're seeing in the beating, right? We're seeing this diurnal cycle of that Amazon moisture that you see clearly in the tracers. You don't see it in the total, you see it in the tracers. And that was that beating that we were after. So we have a minimum in the early morning around 8 a.m. in central Amazon. So there's 3 time zones in the Amazon. So it's 8 a.m. central, and a maximum at night, 8 p.m. local. So the first kind of suspect is ET, right? So evapotranspiration has a very clear diurnal cycle. So here we see, we only see the total because this is what we're tracing. So this is the diurnal cycle. This is the annual cycle. So a much weaker annual cycle than a diurnal cycle. And and it increases from the early morning until the late afternoon due to photosynthetic activity of plants and vapor pressure deficit. Essentially, that's what controls this diurnal cycle. The second, this diurnal pattern in the water vapor not only comes from evapotranspiration, right? We have to look at the source, but also the sink. And precipitation, total precipitation and recycled precipitation actually show very similar characteristic timescale. So we also see the annual, we see the 6-month, and we see the diurnal. So for both the total precip and the tracer precip. And this is due to the fact that we have a lot of convective precipitation, and that convective precipitation peaks in the late afternoon and evening. And here we see a comparison of WRF with TRIM. One thing that I do have to highlight is that while WRF is capturing a diurnal cycle, it seems to be sustaining it for too long. So here into 0 UTC, whereas the TRIM data has already decreased. So of course, I mean, these are not convective resolving simulations. We know there's going to be some problems with the precip, but at least we're getting a diurnal cycle with the precip. And the diurnal cycle is almost exactly the same for the tracer. And then the third part of this is advection, right? So we have evapotranspiration, we have precip, and we have advection of this moisture basically out of the basin. So the total IVT has a very strong annual cycle and a very strong diurnal cycle. And this diurnal cycle is linked to the South American low-level jet. And so just like the North American low-level jet is linked to boundary layer dynamics, the same happens in South America, where you have an intensification of these winds when the boundary layer collapses at night. The tracer IVT shows a lot of different timescales of variability, including the diurnal cycle, but it's kind of a less clean signal than the total IVT. And again, so the tracer IVT has this maximum at night and minimum in the afternoon, linked to the South American low-level jet and boundary layer processes. So what these WRF with tracers have allowed us to do is to look at the hydroclimate of the Amazon at scales that had not been studied before. So at these diurnal time scales, where you have vapor flux coming from the Atlantic and entering the Amazon. Then you have evapotranspiration that's increasing from the early morning to the late afternoon. And then you have convection that rains out some of this moisture in the early evening. And then you have this South American low-level jet that sweeps this vapor away at nighttime when the winds are intensifying. So if we take a step back, this means, so if you, when you think about water vapor in the atmosphere, you're taught that the characteristic lifetime of water vapor in the atmosphere is about 10 days, right? It means that in the Amazon, with this kind of very active cycle, you have younger water than in other parts of the world. So it only kind of, if you think about the time scales of the lifetime of that water vapor in the Amazon, it seems to be driven by this diurnal cycle, as opposed to the much longer time scales in places such as here, the mid-latitudes. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the second part of the work, which is why I got into precipitation recycling in the first place as a graduate student, which is what's going to happen as we continue to deforest the Amazon. So we know that nearly 17% of the Amazon forest has been transformed for human production. And so what I'm showing you here is a time series of deforested area per year. We see there's a peak 2005, and then strong governmental policies really brought that rate down, that deforestation rate down. Unfortunately, there's been a recent expansion of cattle ranching, agriculture, and mining that posed this renewed threat for the Amazon. And this was all over the news in 2019, I remember, before COVID. So the question is, how will continued deforestation change the Amazonian hydroclimate? So to answer this question, we performed experiments. So we had a control simulation, which are the results that you just saw. And then we had a business as usual deforestation scenario based on the work of Suarez Filo et al. 2006, where essentially we replaced these areas with crops. So all of this yellow that is currently forest, we replaced it with crops in this scenario. And this work has been published in 2020. I'm going to focus on the central and southern Amazon for simplicity because there's a lot of stuff going on here. So that's where I'm going to focus my analysis. Okay, so again, all of these figures will look the same, so I need to spend a little bit of time to explain how we're visualizing this. So this is the difference between the experiment minus control of, so the experiment will be the deforestation. Anything magenta will be decreased. Anything green will be increased. Statistical significance are these kind of dotted pixels. And these areas that you see very clearly, particularly here in this graph, are where we're deforesting. So that's where we did the experiment. So another important thing is that this varies completely by season. So I'm going to first show the dry season and then the wet season. So during the dry season, the deforested runs show clearly decreased evapotranspiration. So less evapotranspiration over this region that has been deforested, as one would expect. You have higher temperatures here in the deforested regions, but essentially all over the Amazon. So higher temperatures all over, statistically significant. Less total water vapor. So all of this pink is decreased total water vapor. And of course, when we're talking about the tracers, very high drop in tracer integrated water vapor when we do the deforestation. Recycling ratio decreases throughout most of the region. So of course, because the tracers are reduced. However, total precipitation does not change. So this is a time of year where we have very little precip in general. So remember, I'm mostly focused on this region here, central southern Amazon. So the total precip really does not change hardly at all. So let's look at the wet season. So during the wet season, we do see a very significant decrease in precipitation and very regionally focused, right? So this region where we focused our deforestation was where we saw the sharpest decrease in precip. So of course, initially I thought, okay, so this must be recycling, right? So there's less recycling, so we have less precip, which is the narrative that we've kind of been having in the literature for years, which is that we have less precip because we have less recycling. But now we have the tracers, so we can figure out if this is true. We see no difference in the recycling ratio. So during the wet season, despite the fact that we have less precip, we do not see changes in the recycling ratio. Okay, so I was very confused when we got this result. And so we spent months trying to figure out what was the physical mechanism that was causing this decrease in precipitation. And what we found was that the dominant mechanisms are related to changes in low-level circulation. So one of the things that happens is that when you replace the forests with crops, you have lower surface roughness, and this results in higher winds. So here, all of this green, this is 10-meter winds. So we're having much higher winds close to the surface. And when you look at integrated vapor transport, we have a clear increase in integrated vapor transport over the deforested regions. One of the things that we found, which was surprising to us, was that we have slightly higher ET over the crops. And again, I was concerned when I saw this. I was like, oh gosh, is WRF completely out to lunch here? We do find evidence that at least like in Santarem, in the flux towers, K67 and 77, we have some evidence that during the wet season, the pasture transpires more than the natural forest, but we still need to do a lot of work with remote sensing to try to figure out, how robust is this result. But in general, what we find is that there's an increase in moisture export during the wet season in the deforested simulation. I do have to say that there have been previous studies using global models that have also found something similar, but it's a different physical mechanism. So you have a decrease in precipitation over the Amazon, and we do find increased precipitation over the parts of the La Plata River Basin. This is not statistically significant, but we do find a signal. Yeah, so decrease in precipitation in the wet season likely due to increased moisture export from the deforested area. So my initial hypothesis going into this work was recycling is going to be decreased in the deforestation scenario, causing decreased precip, but we found that it was more related to surface roughness changes. But we do anyway see the decrease in precip that other studies have found as well. So in conclusion, during the dry season, so things are very different in the dry season and in the wet season. So in the dry season, June to October, we see very significant, so the black is the control and the red is the experiment with the deforestation. And we have sharp decrease in evapotranspiration, increase in temperature, and basically no change in precip. So this again averaged over the basin. And this is a cartoon of how this would change. But during the wet season, we have very clear decrease in precipitation over the deforested regions due to changes in the circulation. So basically enhancement of the South American low-level jet, but not due to changes in recycling. And okay, so in conclusion, we see that at the diurnal times, the tracers have allowed us kind of this peek into time scales and spatial scales that had not been looked at before. So we have this very clear diurnal cycle where moisture from evapotranspiration accumulates as the plants and soil evaporate. And then some of that water rains out in convective processes, and another part of it is swept away by strong nocturnal winds associated with the jet. When we do experiments of deforestation, we find that these results are very different depending on what season you're looking at. And in fact, we do see the changes in precipitation that have been seen by other studies, but the tracers tell us that it's not due to recycling, it's due to changes in surface roughness. Okay, so I did want to put this slide to kind of give you a glimpse as to what we're working on now. The first is that, you know, the study that I did was with a 20-kilometer resolution simulation, 10 years. And now we're working with NCAR RAL, and doing 20-year, 4-kilometer convective resolving simulations over the South American continent. So we have this group, the South America Affinity Group. So if any of you is interested, just send me an email and we'll get you on the list. Basically, we meet every couple of weeks and talk about this effort. And preliminary results show that we are able, well, to capture the monthly precipitation, but we are able to capture mesoscale convective systems, which are super important in the Amazon, in the La Plata. They're very important, and over Colombia, the west coast of Colombia, they're super important. So we're very excited about, you know, the preliminary results from these high resolution runs. And I would like to acknowledge NSF for the funding, and my group, primarily Jorge, Deviansh, and Zhao, who've been very active in this particular work. And with that, I leave it to questions.